Chapter 10 of Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 9. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary Ann. Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 9, by John Hay and John George Nicolay. Chapter 10, Mobile Bay. It became evident soon after the capture of New Orleans that to give the desired efficiency to the blockade of the Gulf of Mexico, it would be necessary for the Navy to gain possession of Mobile Bay. However close a watch the Union fleet kept over the low and sandy shores of Alabama, it was impossible to prevent a good many vessels from slipping in, under cover of night or of fog, with their cargoes of necessaries or luxuries from Europe, or from running out with their costly cotton bales. The trade was so lucrative as to justify the greatest risks. Not only munitions of war were thus brought in, but up to the last there was a keen demand for articles of taste and finery. It is true that the ladies of Alabama early in the contest learned their needed lesson of privation and self-denial. Their ingenuity, stimulated by the blockade, displayed itself in 1,000 clever devices. They learned to make their own clothes from the products of the soil, with absolutely no intervention of the manufacturer. They spun, carded, and wove their cloth from the cotton or wool of their own plantations. Every herb of the forest furnished them a dye-stuff. They made buttons of dried gourds or persimmon seeds. Elegant fans were devised from the feathers of geese and peacocks. When kid and calfskin became unattainable, they made shoes of swineskin. Many a Southern belle presented herself at church with innocent pride in raiment in which every detail was the work of her own hands, or entertained her visitors with a cup of tea made of the dried leaves of the holly or the blackberry, or coffee made of parched yam, or of the seeds of the okra plant, sweetened with sugar of delicious flavor, obtained by boiling the juice of the watermelon. When coal oil failed, they lighted their tea tables with candles of tallow or beeswax, bleached in the shade of the trees as white as sperm, or with the burning globes of the sweet gum tree floating in bowls of lard. But human virtue and austerity have their limits, and when the rumor flew through the plantations of the Gulf States that a steamer from Liverpool or Havre had run the blockade with a cargo of prints and ribbons, the young ladies were drawn to the nearest city as by an irresistible magnet. Scarce as money was, they would eagerly give $12 a yard for the simplest calicoes, $100 for a plain straw hat, $375 for a pair of Morocco shoes. A pound of genuine coffee cost $70. A pound of good tea commanded a price as uncertain as that of a Teniers at an auction. But these frivolities formed the least part of the cargoes of the blockade runners. They aided in keeping the Confederacy alive by the military stores they brought and the cotton they took away. During the latter part of the year 1863 and the beginning of the following year, it was the constant wish of the government and of Admiral Farragut as well that the naval force in the Gulf should take possession of the harbor of Mobile, but the exigencies of the campaigns in the East and West for a long time prevented the detachment of an adequate land force to assist him, and as such an attack could not be successfully made without ironclads, the want of them still further delayed him. It was no light undertaking. The city of Mobile stands at the head of the bay which stretches 30 miles northward from the Gulf of Mexico. At the southern end it is 15 miles in width, narrowing to 6 as it reaches the city. Throughout the greater part of its area the water is only 12 or 14 feet deep, with gently shelving shores, but there is a channel 2½ miles wide, running from the mouth of the bay 6 miles northward, in which the depth is from 20 to 24 feet. The main entrance was guarded by 2 low-lying sand points, both strongly fortified. On the east Mobile Point, a projection of the mainland, with Fort Morgan, and on the west Dauphin Island, one of the chain which separates Mississippi Sound from the Gulf, with Fort Gaines. There was a passage into the bay from the Sound by way of Grant's Pass, guarded by Fort Powell, but it was practicable only to vessels of light draft. The only way in for Farragut and his fleet was between the guns of Morgan and Gaines. There was not much to be feared from the latter fort, as it was more than 2 miles from the channel. A line of piles was planted along this entire distance to force all vessels entering the harbor to pass directly under the guns of Fort Morgan. This was a work of great strength, and since its seizure by the Confederates they had thrown up in addition heavy exterior water batteries. The main fort carried 40 guns, and the outer works 7 more. The channel was thickly planted with torpedoes. A narrow gap was left for the convenience of blockade runners, its limit being marked with buoys. Every student of history of the rebellion will be struck with the remarkable energy and ingenuity displayed in the South in supplying their war material. A state of war powerfully stimulates production and invention in every department of human activity. In the North there was a vast development of intelligent industry aided by unbounded resources and opportunities. The pressure of necessity in the South, acting upon minds of great natural aptitude, produced astonishing results in the way of invention and in the adaptation of narrow means to important ends. Their deficiency in other means of harbor defense led them to devise and elaborate a system of torpedoes which proved terribly fatal to the national ships of war, and the ironclads, which in their poverty and isolation they improvised from the slender means at their disposal, were superior in strength and efficiency to anything the world had hitherto seen. Their blockade runners furnished them for a while with arms and ammunition from Europe, but as the blockade became more stringent, they had to look to their own resources for such supplies, and so long as the war lasted they never failed, whatever else was lacking, to have powder and ball sufficient for their needs. When their store of percussion caps threatened to give out, an ingenious mechanic from Lynchburg invented a machine which could fill and press 1,000,000 caps a day. When the sheet of copper in the country was exhausted, they made caps of all the turpentine and brandy stills that could be found in North Carolina. When, near the close of the war, the pinch of the blockade grew so tight that no mercury could be obtained from abroad, the Confederate chemists found they could make a fulminate from their caps with chlorate of potash and sulphuret of antimony. The Tredegar works cast excellent light cannon. After the precious niter beds of Tennessee were lost by the advance of the Northern Army, artificial beds were formed over all the Confederacy. The large arsenal at Augusta, Georgia, was devoted to the manufacture of gunpowder, and up to the final catastrophe it supplied all that was wanted of the best quality. When Richmond fell, a large quantity of this powder was destroyed by the panic-stricken officers of the Confederacy, with consequences more disastrous to their capital than all it had suffered from their enemies up to that time. From time to time during the preceding year, Farragut had heard reports of the building and equipment of the ram Tennessee, which promised to be the most formidable vessel ever constructed by the Confederacy, and which really turned out to be one of the most effective craft for harbor defense ever built. He was especially anxious to make his attack early in the season before this much heralded monster should make her appearance in the lower bay. But the spring passed away before his reinforcements joined him, and the Tennessee, which had been launched in the winter at Selma and towed 150 miles to Mobile, there received her plating, which had been sent to meet her from the rolling mills of Atlanta, and in March was ready for service, and took on as her commander J.D. Johnston. 8 miles below Mobile is a series of mud flats stretching across the bay and called Dog River Bar. The draft of the Tennessee was too great to pass this obstruction, and Farragut, hearing where she was, chafed against his enforced inaction, while the Confederates prepared the camels to float her over the bar, an operation which required 2 months. On the 18th of May she crossed safely over and anchored in the waters of the lower bay. It was the intention of the Confederates to sally out of the pass and attack Farragut in his wooden ships, but the ram proved unexpectedly slow and unwieldy, and it was resolved to keep inside and use her for the defense of the harbor. Besides her own commander, she had on board the admiral of the Confederate Navy, Franklin Buchanan, the same accomplished officer who had fought the Merrimac with such skill and bravery. In spite of her slowness, due to the fact that her machinery was not made for her but taken from a light draft river steamer, she was still a vessel of considerable importance. Her length on deck was 209 feet, her beam 48 feet, and with her armament on board she drew 14 feet. A little over 2/3 of her deck space was occupied by a casemate protecting her battery. The hull was strongly built of oak and yellow pine. The sides were protected by an overhang covered with 4 inches of wrought iron, which extended 6 feet below the waterline. The deck was armored with wrought iron plates 2 inches thick. The casemate was very strong. The sides and ends were inclined at an angle of 45 degrees, built of heavy yellow pine beams, a vertical and a horizontal layer, and outside of that layer of 4 inches of oak to which the iron plating was secured, 6 inches forward and 5 inches abaft, and on the sides. It was covered on top with wrought iron gratings. She carried 6 Brooke rifled guns firing 95 and 100-pound shot. About 2 feet under water projected a strong iron beak formed by a continuation of the knuckle of the overhang. In addition to the Tennessee, the harbor was defended by 3 gunboats, the Selma, the Gaines, and the Morgan. Midsummer came and passed before Farragut got the troops and ironclads which were necessary for his attack. But on the 4th of August, General Gordon Granger landed with some 5,000 troops on Dauphin Island in rear of Fort Gaines, and the same evening the Tecumseh, the last of the eagerly expected ironclads, reported to Farragut outside the harbor. The attack, which was to have been made on the 4th, was therefore postponed till the next day, a fortunate circumstance, as in the meanwhile the Confederates threw into Fort Gaines a large reinforcement of men and arms, which only swelled the trophies of the victory. It rained hard on the evening of the 4th, and Farragut waited with intense expectation to see what sort of weather would follow the shower. He needed a flood tide to carry in his ships and a westerly wind to blow his smoke towards the fort. At midnight the rain ceased, and for a few hours the sky was clear and the ocean calm. The night was sultry, and Farragut slept ill. At 3 o'clock he sent his steward to inquire how the wind was. On learning it blew from the southwest, he at once gave orders to go in. The vessels were lashed together, 2 and 2, the lighter ones on the side away from the fort, so that if one were crippled her consort might tow her in. If both were disabled, the flood tide was relied upon to perform this office. The 4 monitors took up their positions between the wooden ships and Fort Morgan. Their double duty was to keep down the fire of the fort and to be ready to attack the Tennessee as soon as the harbor was entered. The Brooklyn, under Captain James Alden, with her mate the Octorara, led the column, the admiral following in the Hartford, Captain Percival Drayton, attended by the Metacomet. To this arrangement Farragut yielded only at the urgent request of his commanders. He insisted that exposure was one of the penalties of rank and ought not to be avoided. He finally consented to let the Brooklyn precede him only on the plea that she was better provided with chase guns and had an ingenious contrivance for picking up torpedoes. But destiny sided with him at last, and he was to enter the harbor after all, with his broad blue pennant flying in the van of the fleet. The leading vessels crossed the bar at 10 minutes past 6. The line of battle was rapidly formed, and the stately procession of ships moved forward. The Tecumseh, under the gallant Tunis A.M. Craven, led the way, a little in advance and to the right of the line. She fired the opening shots of the battle at Fort Morgan a little before 7 o'clock, and then moved steadily on to attack the Tennessee. Intent upon the enemy in his front, Craven gave no thought to the deadlier invisible dangers under his keel. He was pushing straight upon the ram when a torpedo exploded directly beneath him. The Tecumseh lurched violently, careened, and sank almost in a moment. Craven, in the pilot-house, felt the shock and knew its fatal significance. He and the pilot rushed for the little door communicating with the deck. There was not room for 2 to pass. The instinct of the chivalrous gentleman asserted itself above the dread of death or the feeling of rank. "After you, pilot," he said. The pilot escaped, and Craven went down with his ship. Captain Alden, in the Brooklyn, was about 300 yards behind the Tecumseh when he witnessed her destruction. A moment after, shoal water was reported, and he observed a line of buoys which indicated torpedoes directly under his bows. He backed to avoid them, and thus came down upon the flagship next astern. Farragut hailed and asked what was the matter. Alden reported torpedoes ahead, but the admiral, to whom this was a danger already foreseen and provided for, and who saw there was greater danger in delaying under the guns of Morgan than in pushing forward, now determined to take the lead, and ordered Alden to follow him. A boat was sent out from the Metacomet to pick up the survivors of the Tecumseh, who were struggling in the water under a heavy fire from the land batteries, and 21 were saved. Over 100 were drowned. The flagship moved to the westward of the Brooklyn, and thus passed through the line of torpedoes. Providentially, none of them exploded, though the cases were heard knocking against the vessel, and the primers snapping. It took some time for the Brooklyn to right herself and steam forward. Meanwhile she and the Richmond, which was next in line, were engaged in a heavy interchange of shots with the fort, which wrapped the vessels, the channel, and the beach in dense clouds of smoke. The battle had become general. the fort, Buchanan's little fleet, the Union ironclads, and the wooden ships all volleying together. On the flagship the admiral had ascended to the maintop, and thinking he might be wounded, he had himself lashed to the mast, unconscious of the figure he would present hereafter in history and in art. On the deck an acting ensign, H. Brownell, was taking notes, as the admiral said, with coolness and accuracy, and at the same time composing to the tremendous obbligato of tumultuous battle one of the finest poems which we owe to the war. While the ships were moving by, the fire of the fort was somewhat subdued by the incessant cannonade from the channel, but when the leading vessels were out of range, the guns of Morgan resumed their work, and the belated vessels bringing up the rear suffered severely, the Oneida being shot through and disabled by a shell bursting in her boiler, though her consort, the Galena, carried her safely away. After the admiral had passed the line of torpedoes, the Hartford became hotly engaged with the Confederate fleet. The 3 smaller gunboats kept up a galling fire upon her as they retreated up the bay, doing great execution. They speedily disabled one of her bow guns and killed and wounded many of her crew. As the Hartford came abreast of the Tennessee's station, the formidable ram dashed out upon her. The Hartford, however, was so far superior in speed and dexterity of handling that Buchanan, who was especially anxious to sink the flagship, could not reach her, and they parted company with an exchange of broadsides. After a brief pursuit, which was hopeless from the beginning, the Tennessee turned her attention to the rest of the fleet, and Farragut sent the Metacomet after the rebel gunboats. She chased them through a heavy squall, in mist and rain, into shallow water, and there, pursuing them into the soft ooze, drove the Gaines, which had been injured in the fight, to the shelter of the fort, where she was burned by the rebels, and engaged and captured the Selma. The Morgan got away under the guns of the fort, and in the night made her escape to Mobile. The Tennessee, after leaving the Hartford, went down the line of the advancing fleet and engaged in a running fight, doing little damage considering her strength and opportunities. She first aimed at the Brooklyn, but seeing the torpedo tackle on her bows, and mistaking it for a torpedo, she sheered off, firing 2 effective shots as she went by. She next engaged the Richmond, doing no harm, and moved along the line, passing by the Lackawanna, colliding with the Monongahela, firing damaging shot into the Kennebec, and giving the Ossipee 2 shots below the spar-deck. She had got now to the end of the line, where lay the crippled Oneida, apparently an easy prey. She gave her a raking shot, severely wounding Commander J.R.M. Mullaney, and would have rammed and sunk her, but for the intervention of the ironclad Winnebago. It was then about 8:30, and although Buchanan had done surprisingly little injury in this rapid raid down the Union line, he had at least had a cheering and encouraging experience, and had convinced himself of his own invulnerability in face of the wooden ships. He therefore ordered Johnston to turn and attack the Union fleet again. Farragut, thinking the battle was over until he should choose to renew it, ordered the fleet to anchor and the men to breakfast. But scarcely were they seated when the Tennessee, which had been turning her head northward under the guns of the fort, was observed making directly for the flagship. Percival Drayton could at first hardly believe his eyes. The splendid temerity of the ram in attacking such odds was almost incredible. There were but a few minutes to prepare for her. Her black mass swelled every instant upon the eye. Orders were at once signaled to every available ship to attack the ram, not only with guns, but bows on also. She must be destroyed, no matter what vessels were dashed to pieces against her ironsides. The Monongahela was first to strike her, but lost her iron prow and cutwater by the blow, and could not avoid a deadly shot in the act. A shell passed through her berth deck, exploding and wounding an officer and 2 men. The Monongahela fired a broadside at 10 yards, which rattled harmlessly off the side of the Tennessee. The Lackawanna struck her next at full speed, with far more damage to herself than to the ram, her stem being cut and crushed to the plank ends, with no effect upon the Tennessee except to give her a heavy list. The 2 vessels swung round till their port sides touched, and the Lackawanna fired a 9-inch gun, smashing one of the Tennessee's port shutters. The Lackawanna drew off to ram again, while the Hartford, coming on at full speed, struck the Tennessee a glancing blow and poured in upon her an unavailing broadside, the ram replying for the last time. In the eagerness of the big ships to run down the ram, they got in each other's way. The Lackawanna struck the Hartford near where Farragut was standing, cutting down the flagship within 2 feet of the water's edge. The undaunted admiral, seeing his ship was not sinking, made ready for another rush, which fortunately was not needed. The monitors had now approached and begun their work. The Manhattan, with one gun disabled, struck the casemate of the Tennessee a terrible blow with a shot from her 15-inch gun, loaded with a double charge of 65 pounds of powder. It pierced the armor of the ram, not going through the wood, but leaving a hanging mass of oak and pine splinters on the inside. The Chickasaw got under the stern of the Tennessee and hung on like a bulldog, keeping up an obstinate fight with her 4 11-inch guns. A lucky shot severed the tiller chains of the Tennessee. Her smokestack was shot away, and the smoke poured in suffocating volumes upon the gun deck. The monitors surrounded her, pouring in their relentless volleys, and the great ships were approaching again to run her down. Buchanan, however, was still full of pluck. He had no thought of giving up. He was fighting a battery himself, and called a machinist to put a jammed shutter to rights. A shot struck the side with such frightful force that the man flew into pieces like a glass vase, and Buchanan's leg was broken. Johnston at 10 o'clock went on deck and displayed the white flag. He was just in time. The Ossipee was upon him, coming on at full speed, but her courteous commander, W.E. Leroy, backed his vessel so that the boats came lightly together. Bowing with easy grace to his beaten enemy, as if they were passing each other on Pennsylvania Avenue, Leroy shouted, "Hello, Johnston, old fellow, how are you?" typifying with this frank friendliness the spirit in which all true men of the North wished the war to end. The Tennessee was a noble prize, despite her injuries, which were such as could be easily repaired. She and her little consorts had fought all Farragut's fleet for over an hour. She had lost but 2 men killed and 10 wounded. Farragut had lost, from the fire of the forts and of the Confederate squadron, leaving out those drowned in the Tecumseh, 52 killed and 170 wounded. The flagship was the principal sufferer in killed, though there were more men wounded on the Brooklyn. The Chickasaw, the most efficient of the ironclads, energetically continued the day's work. After towing the prize to her anchorage near the flagship, she steamed down to Fort Powell, taking the work in reverse, and bombarded it for an hour. When night came on, the fort was evacuated and blown up. On the 7th, after a heavy shelling from the Chickasaw, Colonel C.D. Anderson, commanding Fort Gaines, surrendered with his entire garrison of over 800 men. These works being taken, and Grant's pass thus opened to the light draft vessels, the control of the harbor and the supplies of the fleet were secured, even if Fort Morgan had held out indefinitely. In fact, the only sensible course open to its commander, General R.L. Page, was to evacuate the place and save its garrison and as much of the material as possible. He was apparently incapable of so wise a resolution. He signaled Anderson to hold on at all hazards and bitterly blamed him for the surrender, and for his own part simply waited for Farragut and Granger to come and take him. This they did 2 weeks after Gaines surrendered. The fort was invested by the land forces and by a battery sent ashore from the fleet. The bombardment began at daylight on the 22nd of August, from the shore batteries and from the naval force inside the bay and outside in the Gulf, and continued all day. At night the citadel took fire. Early in the morning of the 23rd an explosion was seen. At 6:30 the fort displayed the white flag. Terms of unconditional surrender were offered and accepted, and at 2 o'clock the Union forces took possession. Farragut then found, to his deep indignation, that most of the guns were spiked and the stores destroyed, that General Page and several of his officers had no swords to deliver up, while those that were surrendered were broken, an action which even the genial admiral characterized in his report as childish spitefulness. The harbor was thus secured, the outer defenses of Mobile captured, 104 guns and about 1,500 men taken, and the Gulf port closed forever to Confederate commerce and war. The city itself was now of no more importance than an island town, and amid the exigencies of the great campaigns that occupied the latter half of 1864, it was not thought advisable to detach the troops required for its capture. In March of the year 1865, at the opening of the final campaigns to which the Confederacy succumbed, General E.R.S. Canby moved with 2 corps against Mobile. It was then the headquarters of the department commanded by General Richard Taylor, General D.H. Maury being in immediate charge of the city and its defenses with a force of some 15,000 men. The force brought against it by Canby was nearly twice as great, and the Navy under Admiral Henry K. Thatcher of course made an overwhelming preponderance of strength. But the contest was not so unequal as it might seem. The city was strongly fortified on every side, and defended also by a network of streams. The water of the bay was so shallow that ships of heavy draught could not easily come within shelling distance of the town, and was everywhere thickly planted with torpedoes. Still, the forces controlled by Canby and Thatcher were sure, sooner or later, to take the place. It was determined to make the attack from the eastern side, where the defenses seemed less formidable than on the west. The 13th Corps, under Granger, with Grierson's cavalry, marched from Mobile Point around Bon Secours Bay, and General Steele, with a division of Negro soldiers, was sent from Pensacola direct upon Fort Blakely, a formidable work near the mouth of the Blakely, the west branch of the Tensaw River. He met with little opposition, except from Clanton's Alabama cavalry, which he defeated, capturing Clanton and 275 of his men, and arrived before Fort Blakely on the 29th of March, and there established the right of the Union line. A.J. Smith with the 16th Corps came next, and the 13th held the left. The right soon invested Fort Blakely. The left had already invested the so-called Spanish fort some 3 miles further south. The Navy moved up and crossed Dog River Bar, and opened on the rebel works with 5 ironclads and the double-ender Octorara. So thorough a search had been made for torpedoes that the Navy felt comparatively safe, but their confidence was misplaced. The Milwaukee was sunk on the 28th, the Osage the next day. The light draft Rodolph, coming to raise the Milwaukee, was herself sunk the 1st of April. And at a later period, after the campaign was ended, 4 other vessels were lost by the same effective means. On the evening of the 8th of April, the preparations having been completed, all the batteries from land and bay opened upon Spanish Fort, and a terrible fire was kept up until nearly midnight, when the guns of the fort were silenced, and the great place being no longer tenable, the garrison in great part escaped in the darkness. The Union troops entered the fort immediately and succeeded in capturing over 600 prisoners and 30 heavy guns. As soon as the sun rose on the 9th, the sun whose rising saw Sheridan athwart Lee's front at Appomattox, and whose setting saw the Confederate banners furled forever in Virginia, preparations were promptly made for the final assault upon Fort Blakely, which was to close the war in Alabama. At 5:30 in the afternoon, Steele ordered his forces to assault the fort. It was a strong work, surrounded with every obstacle which the Confederates had been able in a year's leisure to place before it. But the Union troops, flushed with success, went at it with such spirit that neither ditch, abatis, nor a storm of grape and canister could keep them out. The colored troops on the right of the line especially distinguished themselves by their courage and conduct in this final grapple with their former masters. At 7 o'clock, the Union forces were in possession of the work, with all the garrison, some 300 prisoners, and a great store of guns, flags, and small arms. They lost heavily in killed and wounded, about 1,000 to the Confederates' 500. Mobile was at the mercy of Canby and Thatcher. But 3 more days were required in which to complete the work. The fleet busied itself next day in clearing away torpedoes and working its way up abreast of the captured forts. The guns of Spanish Fort were now turned on Forts Huger and Tracy a little to the north, and the Navy aiding, the Confederates were driven from them on the 11th, and the Blue Jackets took possession. Commander Pierce Crosby continued his work with the torpedoes, reaping a plentiful harvest. He lifted that day 150. When a safe path was opened, Commander James S. Palmer, with the Octorara and the ironclads, threaded his way through the Blakely and Tensaw rivers to within a mile of Mobile, where the fair city lay helpless beneath his guns. Admiral Thatcher about the same time went directly across the bay with 8,000 troops under Gordon Granger towards the city, which at once surrendered. The Confederate army and navy had fled up the Tombigbee River, having previously sunk the ironclads Huntsville and Tuscaloosa, which had passed all their inglorious lives at the wharf. Commander Palmer was dispatched up the Tombigbee in pursuit of the flying Confederate navy, but the banks of that quiet stream were spared the spectacle of a naval battle. Commander E. Farrand surrendered his fleet of 1 ironclad and 4 river steamers at Citronelle on the 4th of May, at the same time that General Taylor capitulated with his army. 112 naval officers, 285 enlisted men, and 24 Marines were paroled, a proportion of epaulets, which showed how the Confederacy had gone to seed. A week before, the rebel navy in the Mississippi had come to a violent end. The ram Webb, which had gained a reputation in the West by the destruction of the Indianola, was ready for sea when the final catastrophe came at Appomattox. She was loaded with cotton, rosin, and turpentine, and her officers determined to make a bold break for freedom and a market. She passed New Orleans in broad day on the 24th of April, flying the Union flag and steaming rapidly down the river. She was recognized. A few ineffectual shots were fired at her, and 4 steamers started in pursuit. She had a good lead and might have escaped, but about 25 miles below the city she met the Richmond coming upstream. This was her sentence of death. Her commander ran her ashore and set her afire. Her inflammable cargo blazed up like tinder. Her crew scrambled on shore and were captured. End of chapter 10.